Today, I want to walk you through the history of Bangladesh, but not just as a timeline. Instead, I want to look at how law, rights, and justice constantly shaped the country's identity. My opinion is pretty simple. Bangladesh's entire history shows that when laws don't reflect people's rights, conflict becomes unavoidable. And when laws do reflect people's needs, societies stabilize and grow. Let's break that down. Ancient to medieval Bengal, where law first mattered. Bangladesh might be a young country, but the region's legal thinking goes way back. Ancient cities like Mahasthangar and Pundranagar weren't just trade hubs, they were early examples of governments using law to keep communities fair and functional. Even at that time, leaders understood something we still debate today: laws only work if they protect people. Later, under the Bengal Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, things got more layered. Islamic courts worked beside village councils and local customs. These overlapping systems show that early Bengal recognized that law has to fit the people it serves, not the other way around. This idea becomes important later in Bangladesh's fight for rights. British rule. When law becomes a tool of inequality. The real disruption came with British colonial rule. They brought in English common law and policies like the permanent settlement, which handed huge power to landlords and pushed farmers into poverty. This is where we see a clear legal conflict. Colonial laws protected economic interests, not human rights. Rebellions like the Indigo Revolt weren't just political, they were people demanding fairness within the legal system itself. Already, you see the foundational idea of human rights emerging. Laws must be just, or they lose legitimacy. 1947 to 1971, the language of rights. When British India was partitioned in 1947, East Bengal became East Pakistan. Legally, both wings were supposed to be equal, but in reality, East Pakistan's cultural and linguistic identity was ignored. The government declaring Urdu the only state language in 1948 is a perfect example of law violating cultural rights. The 1952 language movement, where students died protesting, proves how essential legal recognition is to identity. The fight wasn't just about a language, it was about the right to exist within the law. This is why February 21st became International Mother Language Day, recognized globally. It's a powerful reminder of how cultural rights fit into international human rights law. 1971, when legal rights are refused, conflict erupts. By 1970, East Pakistan clearly won the national election. Legally, they had the democratic right to govern. When West Pakistan refused to transfer power, it was a direct violation of constitutional and democratic rights. This sparked the 1971 Liberation War, where Bangladesh declared independence on March 26. Even during the war, leaders set up a provisional government, showing how essential legal structure is, even in moments of crisis. Bangladesh officially became independent on December 16, 1971. 1972 Constitution, building a rights-based state. In 1972, Bangladesh wrote its first constitution. It centered on four principles: nationalism, democracy, socialism, and secularism, and guaranteed fundamental rights like equality before the law and the protection of freedoms. From a legal perspective, this was Bangladesh's declaration that human rights would be the foundation of the new state. Even though the country later faced political instability and military coups, these constitutional values continued to serve as a roadmap for justice and governance. Modern Bangladesh, expanding human rights law. Today, Bangladesh is still developing its legal protections in areas like women's rights, labor rights, environmental and climate law, digital and privacy rights. You can see the influence of international human rights law, ICHL, here. Treaties, customary law, and global norms guide many reforms. Bangladesh interacts with major global legal documents like the UN Charter, UDCHR, and Geneva Conventions, especially in matters involving refugees and humanitarian issues. This shows that human rights law isn't just domestic, it's part of a bigger global framework that countries must navigate. Leadership and how the people got power. Just 4 years after independence, Bangladesh experienced a devastating military coup on August 15, 1975, when its founding father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, was assassinated along with most of his family and close associates by military officers while he slept in his Dhaka home. Mujib was more the father of the nation, and his murder plunged the country into political turmoil and brutality. At the time, Hasina, his eldest daughter, was out of the country, a twist of fate that saved her life. But that day marked the beginning of years of military interference in Bangladeshi politics. From that point onward, power shifted from elected governments to military figures who ruled first through force and then through manipulated legal systems. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bangladesh was dominated by military rulers like Ziaur Rahman and later Hussein Mohammad Ershad, who suspended constitutional rights and installed martial law to suppress dissent. Under martial law, political opposition was restricted. Fundamental freedoms of speech and assembly were limited. The judiciary's independence was compromised, and violent crackdowns on protests became routine. This wasn't merely authoritarian politics, it was a systematic undermining of human rights under the guise of legal authority. How people fought back, especially students. History often credits the politicians of the time, and rightly so, but one thing that truly defined Bangladesh's resistance to dictatorship from the 1980s onward was the power of student movements. In 1990, when Bangladesh was under the authoritarian rule of General Ershad, a massive pro-democracy uprising erupted. Students, workers, political activists, and ordinary citizens took to the streets demanding an end to military rule. Leaders from across the political spectrum, including Sheikh Hasina and Khalida Zia, once fierce rivals, came together to oppose the regime. The result? Ershad resigned, and by 1991, Bangladesh had restored parliamentary democracy. That moment was a political victory. It was proof that when the legal order becomes unjust, the people's collective voice becomes the corrective mechanism for the law. It was a real-world exercise of rights that the Constitution promised, but dictatorship denied. Sheikh Hasina, a life shaped by struggle and controversy. Let's talk about Sheikh Hasina, a figure whose life embodies both the promise and the peril of political power in Bangladesh. She was born into politics. Her father was not only a leader, but the architect of independence, meaning she grew up immersed in the struggle for national identity and rights. After the 1975 assassination of her father and family, she spent about 6 years in exile, mostly in India, before returning to Bangladesh to lead the Awami League, the political party her father founded. In the early years of her political career, Hasina fought against dictatorship. She united with political rivals, returned to Bangladesh when it was dangerous to do so, and helped shape the democratic movement that toppled Ershad in 1990. Her leadership in the 1990 uprising is an essential part of the human rights arc of Bangladesh. Rather than seek arms against authoritarianism, she stood with crowds of citizens demanding rights and an accountable government. That's a fundamental embodiment of law in everyday life, a recognition that rights are not static privileges, but living claims citizens make. However, history is seldom simple. When Hasina became prime minister, first in the mid-1990s, and most notably from 2009 onward, her tenure wasn't free from controversy. Critics charged her government with restricting media freedom, cracking down on opposition voices, and using security forces to quell dissent. Supporters pointed to her role in economic development and infrastructure growth. Then came 2024, a turning point that once again showed how human rights and law collide in Bangladesh. The 2024 uprising and the collapse of Hasina's rule. In July 2024, what started as a student protest over job quotas in public sector hiring grew into a massive nationwide movement. Students challenged what they saw as unfair privileges and blocked access to equal opportunities, a deeply felt human rights issue rooted in fairness and rule of law. The government's response was forceful and deadly. Estimates from international observers suggest that more than 1,000 people were killed by security forces during the protests, the deadliest political violence since independence. As protests spread, Hasina's government declared a state of emergency. Ultimately, she fled Bangladesh in August 2024 and took refuge in India, a dramatic reversal for a leader once credited with steering the nation through both peaceful and difficult times. What happened next brings us back to the law. A legal reckoning. After the uprising forced Hasina from power, Bangladesh established a neutral interim government under Nobel Peace Prize laureate Muhammad Yunus. The new government refocused the International Crimes Tribunal, a court originally set up during Hasina's own administration to try war crimes from the 1971 war, on cases involving her administration's response to the 2024 uprising. As a result, Hasina was tried in absentia and sentenced to death on charges including ordering lethal force against protesters and failure to prevent atrocities. She received additional sentences, including prison terms for corruption cases. Hasina has denounced the tribunal as politically motivated, arguing she wasn't given a fair trial. Why this moment matters for human rights and law. The arc of Bangladesh's history teaches us several deep lessons. First, law is not self-executing. The mere existence of a constitution and legal institutions doesn't protect rights unless the people demand them and the government respects them. Second, law enforced through force ceases to be law. When governments suppress basic freedoms, whether under military rule or under civilian authority, human rights suffer. Third, and most importantly, this recent period shows something remarkable. In Bangladesh, students, not elites, not politicians alone, once again became the catalyst for change. They didn't only protest. They forced the country to reimagine its legal and political order. And unlike past revolts that were followed by military coups or superficial political reforms, this time, crucially, the movement led to a transitional government accountable to the people and the law. That's a real embodiment of transferable legal skills in everyday life. Ordinary people recognizing when law serves injustice and insisting on better. My opinion. In my view, the 2024 uprising and its aftermath, including both the legal proceedings against Hasina and the rise of a transitional government, reflect a core truth about human rights. Justice cannot be a privilege of rulers, it must be defended by the people and grounded in fair legal process. When citizens can hold leaders accountable, even former leaders, that's a sign the rule of law is not dead. But when legal institutions can be used to settle political scores, that's when human rights falter. Bangladesh's journey from dictatorship to protest to a people-driven transitional government shows both the fragility and the power of rights in practice. It reminds us that law is not just written texts and institutions, it's the everyday struggle to make rights real. And that is the heart of human rights law.